They thought it was over until the defendant handed the judge a flash drive. Elijah Banks moved like a shadow through the narrow halls of the worn-down apartment, careful not to make noise as his father slept in the next room. A tray balanced in his hands, oatmeal, warm tea, the morning pills. The same quiet routine, every day. Outside, the world surged on without him. Inside, time felt slower, more fragile, shaped by silence, blinking monitors, and the faint wheeze of a ventilator. His father, once a towering figure in the courtroom, now lay still most days, paralyzed from a stroke that stole his mobility but not his presence. Even in stillness, there was something commanding about Leonard Banks. His eyes, sharp despite the years, always watching, always thinking. Elijah was 22, a computer science student juggling online coursework and part-time caregiving. He had little room for anything else. Friends faded. Parties were noise he had no use for. There was a time he believed hard work could change anything, that knowledge and discipline would shelter him. But that belief had begun to fray. Not because of a failure on his part, but because of what the world refused to forget. His skin, his name, his quiet refusal to play the part others assigned him. His father had been a lion in court, Leonard Banks, the civil rights attorney who once stood toe-to-toe with judges, city councils, and crooked lawmen. Elijah had watched from the gallery as a boy, legs swinging under courthouse benches, while his father's voice rose and cracked through packed rooms. "You don't fix rot by painting over it," Leonard once told a jury. "You dig it out." But years passed, headlines shifted, and one day the lion fell silent. A stroke mid-argument, a gurney, flashing lights, then the long descent into silence and dependence. Elijah never forgot the sight of his father in that hospital bed, his strength reduced to a single blink when asked if he was in pain. It was in those days Elijah taught himself code. While others played games, he taught himself languages no one around him spoke: Python, C++, cryptography. There was comfort in logic, in the clean simplicity of code. No judgment, no bias. Just input and output. Truth, hidden in patterns. He'd sit for hours, headphones in, the faint wheeze of the oxygen tank behind him, building scripts, solving riddles. His professors called him brilliant. Recruiters took notice. But none of that mattered now. The arrest happened on a Tuesday. The sky was gray, the kind of day that felt half asleep. 2 unmarked cars, a knock at the door, hands gripping his arm before he had time to reach for his ID. The neighbors watched from windows. No one asked why. At the precinct, the questions were fast and cold. Did he work freelance for any finance firms? Did he know Malcolm Thorne? Had he accessed any private accounts within the last 60 days? They showed him lines of code printed on glossy paper, IP logs with timestamps. There were transfers, offshore accounts, thousands rerouted under aliases he didn't recognize. The face on the screen belonged to Malcolm Thorne, a powerful real estate mogul whose influence reached into banks, politics, and the news cycle. The money trail was tight, the prosecution claimed, and all paths led back to Elijah. No one cared that his own bank account held barely enough for rent. No one asked how someone who barely had access to a working laptop managed to outsmart billion-dollar security firewalls. What mattered was that the accused looked the part. Quiet, black, smart, but not the kind of smart they trusted. He insisted he was innocent. The police didn't respond. Neither did his court-appointed attorney, a man who glanced at Elijah like he was already guilty, barely bothering to conceal his impatience. "Best thing you can do," the attorney muttered during their first meeting, "is take a deal." Elijah refused. Deals were for the guilty. The man sighed and slid a folder across the table like he was passing a menu. The media wasted no time. Headlines called Elijah a digital ghost and a cyber thief with a clean face. Pictures from his college profile were pulled and pasted beside articles that painted him as some secret mastermind. He read those articles from his jail cell, sitting cross-legged on a thin mattress, with the scent of bleach and sweat hanging in the air. The lights never turned off. The guards referred to him by his last name only, rarely meeting his eyes. In jail, subtle cruelty replaced overt violence. Meals came late, paperwork disappeared, phone privileges were under review. When he requested a computer to review discovery materials, he was told he'd get one, eventually. Security concerns, they said. His requests to delay the trial were denied. His motions to access evidence were dismissed without explanation. And still, Elijah did not bend. He folded pain into silence. He wrote notes on toilet paper. He memorized every file name he could recall from the brief moment he saw the case documents. He prayed without knowing if he believed anyone was listening. Flashbacks came in quiet waves. His father at the kitchen table, stern but kind, warning him as a teenager not to believe justice was automatic. "The truth doesn't always win," Leonard said one night, his voice low and ragged. "Not unless you're willing to fight for it." At the time, Elijah nodded without understanding. But now, the weight of that lesson pressed on his chest every hour. Isolation gnawed at his thoughts. The other inmates barely spoke to him. Most were waiting for their own trials, and none wanted to be seen siding with the new guy whose face was on the news. Days blended. The food blurred. Time stretched. What kept him from collapsing entirely was something quiet and stubborn inside him, something his father once called fire. Then, a shift. A guard, the older one with the limp, slid something under Elijah's cell door late one night without a word. Just a torn piece of a legal textbook, frayed at the edges, old ink smudged across its yellowed surface. Elijah unfolded it under the flickering light. The message was written in his father's handwriting. Small, deliberate letters. "The truth always leaves a trace. Find it. Store it." His breath caught in his chest. 100 questions stormed through his mind. How had his father sent this? What did he know? Elijah read the message again and again until it etched itself into his bones. It wasn't just a message. It was a code, not just in words, but in meaning. Leonard Banks had spent a lifetime exposing lies. He would never send those words without purpose. Elijah stared at the page for hours. It was a riddle only he could solve. And somewhere, buried beneath firewalls and headlines, behind the noise of accusation and the silence of the cell, the truth waited, unfinished, unburied, and still alive. The days inside the county detention center had begun to blur together. The fluorescent lights never dimmed, and the cold never lifted from the concrete floor. Elijah sat on the edge of his cot, back against the wall, his fingers curled tightly around the edges of the old legal page his father had sent. He had read the words hundreds of times, burned them into his mind. The truth always leaves a trace. Find it. Store it. It wasn't just encouragement, it was instruction. He clung to that idea like a raft in a flood. He couldn't afford to break down. Not yet. He closed his eyes and let his thoughts spiral backward. The night before his arrest played over again in fragments. He remembered leaving his laptop open, a rare lapse. He'd been exhausted, half awake, just finished helping his father with the nightly routine. He had been coding a university project, an automated encryption tool he'd written for fun. The logs showed no suspicious activity, at least none that he could recall. But that was the problem. The police claimed his device had been used to reroute the funds, and yet he couldn't remember anything being off, not until the knock at the door. Elijah began tracing patterns in his head. It was something his father once taught him. If you couldn't investigate outward, investigate inward. What had he done that day? What had he accessed? Who had come to the apartment? He remembered the technician from the assisted care service. He'd been new, friendly, too friendly, had asked to use the bathroom. Elijah recalled walking past the open laptop on the kitchen table. He hadn't thought twice. But now, that memory pulsed like a warning light. The timeline matched. It would have taken less than 5 minutes to plug in a drive, run a script, delete traces. He requested technical logs through his attorney, server access reports, timestamps, keycard records from Thorne's security office. He asked for a list of devices that had been flagged as suspicious during the breach window. His attorney barely concealed his irritation. Those kinds of documents took weeks to process, he muttered. The court would never approve it in time. Elijah tried not to react. He filed the request himself, but each motion returned stamped with red denial ink. Not relevant, not available. Trial date fixed. There was a quiet urgency in the air around the courthouse, like everyone wanted the trial over before anyone could ask too many questions. The businessman's legal team was well-funded, strategic, and relentless. They didn't argue the evidence. They argued the image. They called Elijah a dangerous genius, a tech prodigy who grew bitter from hardship. a loner with access and motive. They painted him as resentful of the system his father once fought, and now determined to tear it down digitally. They found an old comment he made online during a forum debate about income inequality. They twisted his words, framing him as anti-authority. Every headline fed the story. Inside his cell, Elijah felt the noose tightening. Each request he made hit a wall. The guard looked at him sideways every time he asked for paper. His laptop access, initially promised for discovery review, was revoked. "Security risk," they said. His legal pads were sometimes missing when he returned from the yard. A few times his notes came back torn at the edges. It wasn't enough to destroy him physically. The system chipped at the mind first. Still, he refused to unravel. Instead, he built mental structures, maps of what could have happened. He recreated data flows in his head, recalling how the breach logs had been presented in court: local IP, remote shell access, a sequence of fund transfers routed through encrypted tunnels. He'd seen those logs for no more than 3 minutes. But it was enough. The formatting was off, too clean. The timestamps were exact, aligned to the second. A real script, even one he might have written, would leave human inconsistencies, pauses, delays, keyboard latency. Someone had staged it. He scrawled code snippets on the back of food wrappers with pencil lead, rewrote them until the patterns made sense. But that wasn't enough. He needed proof, not a theory, evidence. Then one morning the routine cracked. It happened in the courthouse hallway, just after another denied motion. Elijah stood in chains, wrists sore from the cuffs. His lawyer walked ahead talking with a clerk. A janitor moved past, pushing a mop. Then came a boy, no more than 19, in a courthouse intern badge and worn sneakers. He paused in front of Elijah just long enough to press a tattered Bible into his hands, then leaned in close, voice barely a breath. He said he used to be in Elijah's program, said he remembered his senior project, said he never believed the story, that they wiped the server logs the morning after the arrest, but he saved something. He tucked it in the Bible's hollowed pages, told Elijah it was his shot. Then the boy vanished down the corridor like mist. Back in the cell, Elijah waited until lights out. He opened the Bible under the blanket, his heart pounding. Inside, taped to the spine, was a black USB drive no longer than his thumb. His hands trembled. He stared at it for a long time, as if it might vanish. He knew better than to ask how Jamal had done it. The boy had taken a risk, a big one. He didn't plug it into anything. He couldn't, not yet. But he studied the drive's label, the serial number, the shape of it, every scratch and groove. He memorized the heat pattern from where it had been handled. He treated it like sacred evidence. He thought about his lawyer, about the indifferent way he had dismissed every theory Elijah proposed, about how quickly he had pushed toward a plea. Elijah knew he couldn't risk exposing this until he understood what it contained. The wrong move could get it dismissed, or worse, disappeared. He waited, silent, calculating. He lay back on the cot, staring at the ceiling. The tension in his shoulders refused to ease. The truth was there. Somewhere in the code, in the trace no one bothered to look for. He could feel it. His father's voice drifted back into his mind, low and calm, like it had sounded in the hospital days after the stroke, when the old man could only whisper, "Truth doesn't always win, unless you're willing to fight for it." Elijah gripped the drive like a lifeline, his body still trembling from exhaustion and fear. But in the stillness of that moment, surrounded by walls meant to break him, something shifted. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was resolve, cold, unflinching. He didn't know what was on the drive, but he would find out. The courtroom felt colder than Elijah remembered. Or maybe it was just the weight of silence pressing down on everything. Wood-paneled walls loomed like sentinels, and the stained ceiling tiles overhead seemed to sag under the tension. His wrists, free of cuffs for the trial, still bore the marks of steel. He sat at the defense table, flanked by an attorney who had stopped pretending to care 3 hearings ago. His tie hung askew, his eyes already scanning the clock instead of the evidence. Across the aisle, the prosecution shuffled confidently through folders, each document another thread in the rope they were eager to tighten around Elijah's neck. The opening statement was swift, rehearsed, and heavy with consequence. The lead prosecutor spoke with measured disdain, calling Elijah brilliant but reckless. A young man with a mind sharp enough to build encryption systems. Sharp enough, they implied, to weaponize them. They described a digital ghost slipping past firewalls, emptying corporate accounts in seconds, all while leaving just enough trace to frame a facade of innocence. And they claimed Elijah Carter had done it all from the comfort of his one-bedroom apartment. His defense offered no real counter-argument. The lawyer mumbled about burden of proof and circumstantial evidence, then slumped back into his chair, already defeated. No mention of the server logs that were never handed over. No mention of the security footage that mysteriously couldn't be recovered. No mention of how Elijah, without legal access to the core systems, could have breached the network from a personal device that was never found in his possession. When Elijah glanced sideways, he saw his lawyer's hands trembling faintly. Not from nerves, but from guilt, or maybe shame. Witnesses took the stand one after another, the prosecution's witnesses. Each testimony layered more dust onto the illusion of guilt. The IT manager from Thorne's tech division was first. He spoke with the confidence of someone who knew his job was safe. He claimed he'd seen Elijah access restricted data just days before the breach. Claimed he'd flagged it but wasn't taken seriously. Claimed he'd sent an internal report. Elijah stared forward, expression unreadable. But beneath the table, his fingers curled against his knee until the nails bit into skin. He remembered meeting that man only once, in a group interview. Another witness, a junior systems analyst, claimed she'd seen Elijah in the company's restricted server room during an open house tour. Claimed he was hovering near the controls. She described him as intense, curious, invasive. Her eyes never quite met his during testimony. Elijah kept silent. A single outburst could be twisted into aggression, into confirmation. Still, his jaw tensed with each lie. He was being erased and rewritten in real time, turned into a caricature of who they needed him to be. Dangerous, intelligent, angry. Then came the financial consultant. He pulled up a slide on the screen, a network diagram showing a flow of funds leading back to an IP address registered to Elijah's old laptop. The slide was clean, designed for clarity and condemnation. The timestamp aligned with the day Elijah had stayed home caring for his father after a bad night of coughing fits. That laptop hadn't left the apartment. But no one asked. No one cross-examined. His lawyer didn't challenge the chain of custody, didn't request metadata. Just nodded, almost apologetically, and muttered something about lack of context. By the third day, the judge's tone had shifted. She interrupted more often, cut off lines of questioning from the defense, leaned into her microphone with clipped impatience. Her questions to the prosecution were brief and affirming. Her questions to Elijah's side were loaded, skeptical. It was clear. She wanted this over with, wanted her docket cleared and her lunch on time. The gravity of the situation didn't pierce the bureaucracy. Elijah was no longer a person, just a case number waiting for conclusion. Inside, Elijah felt the clock ticking faster. He hadn't told his lawyer about the flash drive, couldn't trust him to handle it right, couldn't risk it being dismissed as tampered or inadmissible. He had memorized the contents in his cell, ran the sequence of frames over and over in his mind until he could see them even when his eyes were closed. The file had been simple. A screen recording, no audio, but clear, devastatingly clear. The final day came with no fanfare. The prosecution summarized everything: motive, means, technical ability. A young man with a troubled background and unmatched skill, the perfect candidate for a digital heist. The defense offered a half-hearted rebuttal, mostly resting on character. They mentioned Elijah's clean record, his academic accolades, his father's service. The judge didn't look up from her notes. The gavel was practically in her hand before the closing statements ended, and then it happened. The judge inhaled and began her sentence. Elijah stood up, quietly, deliberately, not dramatic, just enough for heads to turn. He looked directly at the judge and spoke. His voice was steady, almost calm. He said he had evidence, said it was time someone actually looked. The courtroom froze. His lawyer whispered something harsh, tugging at his sleeve. A bailiff moved toward him, uncertain, but the judge raised her hand. Her gaze sharpened, cautious now. She asked what kind of evidence. Elijah reached into his pocket and retrieved the flash drive. The room tightened like a held breath. He said nothing more, just walked forward. The bailiff intercepted but hesitated, glancing at the judge for direction. She nodded. Elijah extended the drive, still silent, still calm. The judge called for a 10-minute recess, then reconsidered. She asked the clerk to set up the monitor. The projector screen lowered slowly, its descent echoing in the hush. Elijah returned to his seat, not looking at his lawyer, not looking at the gallery. His hands rested in his lap, still now, almost at peace. The screen flickered to life. The file opened. The recording began with a login screen, Thorne Corporation's secure server interface. The username field autofilled, E.Carter. The timestamp glowed in the corner, matching the night of the breach to the second. Then the camera panned slightly, revealing a reflection in the black monitor glass. A face, young, impatient. Not Elijah. The courtroom shifted as people leaned in. The man on the screen inserted a USB clone, mirroring Elijah's access credentials. The desktop loaded. Mouse movements flicked with practiced speed, navigating encrypted folders, executing scripts, funds rerouted, accounts drained. A second timestamp appeared at the top of the screen. Metadata from the screen capture software. Verified. Layered. The screen froze on a final image. The culprit's ID badge reflected faintly in the corner of the monitor. The name was unmistakable. It was Thorne's nephew, Brandon Shaw, the man who had been in the courtroom every day, sitting behind the prosecution, the one who shook his head at Elijah's name during each recess, the one who always arrived with a smirk. The judge sat back. Her gavel remained untouched. The silence was heavier now, no longer disbelief, but recognition. She looked at the screen, then at the USB in her hand, then slowly back at Elijah. Her voice, when it came, carried no trace of the earlier impatience. She said this changed everything. The moment the final frame of the video froze on the courtroom screen, the faint glint of Brandon Shaw's ID badge catching the light, there was a half-second of stunned silence, as though the very walls needed time to process what they had just witnessed. Then it broke. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps gave way to shouted whispers, the rustle of reporters scrambling for their phones, and the sound of lawyers from both sides standing up at once. The judge, eyes still locked on the screen, blinked hard as if shaking herself from a trance. Her voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding, calling for an immediate recess. Bailiffs moved in quickly, trying to restore order, but the room had already transformed. No longer a place of judgment, it was now a battlefield of reaction. The prosecution, once so poised and assured, dissolved into visible panic. The lead prosecutor flipped through papers that no longer mattered, searching for rebuttals that didn't exist. His co-counsel leaned in, whispering something with urgency, but there was no salvaging this. The case had shattered on contact with the truth. Elijah remained seated as the commotion surged around him, his hands now still on the table, fingertips barely brushing the wood. A bailiff approached and gently tapped his shoulder. No handcuffs this time. No firm grip on his arm. Just a nod and a soft gesture toward the side door. As Elijah stood, there was no jeering, no accusation in the stares, only the quiet tension of realization. He walked out, not as a suspect, not as a man accused, but as someone finally being seen for who he truly was. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed like gunfire. Reporters pushed and shouted over one another, questions flying with the same hunger that had once painted him guilty without proof. Elijah didn't look at them. His eyes scanned the crowd until they settled on a distant figure standing beneath a gray sky. It was a nurse from the care facility, holding the handles of a wheelchair. His father wasn't visible yet, but Elijah felt the warmth of that presence before he even reached the vehicle. Still, he said nothing. The questions bounced off him like rain on stone. He simply stepped inside the waiting car, the door closing behind him as the city reeled. But the story wasn't finished. Somewhere, several weeks earlier, under the humming fluorescent lights of an empty office, a young man named Jamal had sat at a corner desk, working late. He was quiet, always had been, an intern in a company where silence kept you safe. It was around midnight when he heard it. Laughter. The kind of entitled, careless laugh that filled the air like smoke. Brandon Shaw was in the adjacent room, talking too loud, confident no one was left. He didn't know Jamal was still there, earbuds out, screen dimmed, hiding in plain sight. The conversation drifted through the cracked door, Brandon bragging to a colleague about how easy it had been to pin everything on the code kid, how he'd cloned credentials from a coffee break when Elijah left his laptop unlocked. He joked about how the company would cover it up for him if it ever got messy, said his uncle would never let a headline touch their name. Jamal didn't move, didn't breathe. He knew what that meant. Knew speaking up would not just cost him the internship, it could ruin his career before it began. And for days, he said nothing. He went home with that guilt stitched behind his eyes, watched the trial unfold on his phone during lunch breaks, and told himself someone else would step up. But when he saw Elijah in court, sitting alone, absorbing lie after lie, something inside him broke. He recognized that look. It was the look of someone who had been cornered by power and abandoned by truth. And Jamal realized he couldn't carry that silence anymore. So he came forward. His statement landed like thunder. At first, the DA's office didn't know what to make of it. But Jamal had receipts. Emails Brandon had forwarded by mistake. A screenshot of a message time-stamped a day before the breach, referencing how they'd locked down the kid's credentials. Jamal had saved everything, unsure why at the time, until it became clear. Once his testimony aligned with the footage on Elijah's flash drive, the case turned. No longer just a wrongful prosecution, it became something darker, deeper. A cover-up, a manipulation of justice at the highest levels. Brandon Shaw was arrested within days. The press captured it all, him ducking into a black SUV surrounded by federal agents. His uncle, the powerful businessman who had once dismissed every reporter's question with a smile and a wave, now faced a different kind of scrutiny. He tried to deny involvement, claiming ignorance, distancing himself from his nephew's actions. But it was too late. The court ordered an investigation into corruption, data tampering, and the sudden loss of exonerating files during Elijah's trial. Witness intimidation became a key focus, especially after 2 former employees came forward claiming they'd been pressured to testify or remain silent under the threat of termination. The courtroom that had once been a crucible of injustice now began its transformation into something else, a reckoning. And then, on a gray afternoon, as wind swept the trees outside the courthouse windows, Elijah's father appeared. Not in person, his condition was too fragile, but through a live video feed, propped up in a wheelchair by a nurse, a blanket pulled over thin legs, oxygen tubing curling gently under his nose. The courtroom fell still. No one moved as the judge nodded and the screen flickered to life. His voice was quiet, weathered by time and illness, but resolute. He looked into the camera, his eyes filled with something deeper than anger, something older than rage. And he spoke. They had tried to bury his son under lies, he said. Had tried to drown him in silence and shame. But the truth, he said, had a way of digging itself out, of pushing through the darkness, of finding the light. The room was so quiet afterward, it felt like the entire building had stopped breathing. Elijah sat in the front row. He didn't cry, didn't move, but his eyes stayed on the screen long after it had gone black. The official decision came 3 days later. The charges against Elijah were dropped, fully, publicly, and without condition. The court issued a formal apology, though no words could undo the damage. Reporters surrounded him on the steps of the courthouse, microphones thrust toward his face, cameras rolling, voices pleading for a statement. They wanted sound bites. They wanted fury. They wanted something explosive. But Elijah said nothing. He simply turned and walked down the courthouse steps, each footstep deliberate and sure. His father waited at the curb in a chair, blanket across his lap, eyes full of quiet pride. Elijah reached him, placed a hand on the wheelchair's handle, and together they moved forward. Not as victims, not as symbols, just as father and son. And the crowd parted to let them pass. In the weeks that followed, Elijah found his name carried further than he ever intended. News outlets praised his resilience. Think pieces dissected the trial, and job offers arrived from across the country, startups, universities, even a tech firm overseas. But each time he paused, read the letter, and quietly set it aside. Something in him had changed, not broken, but redirected. The fire that once drove him to build systems for profit now burned with a deeper purpose. So instead of joining someone else's company, he and Jamal founded their own. In a modest brick building on the east side of the city, they opened a non-profit tech lab, low ceilings, second-hand desks, and wires running like vines across the floor. But the mission was sharp. They helped young men, most of them black and brown, gather and protect digital evidence for their defense. Some came in afraid to speak. Some didn't even know their devices held the proof they needed. Elijah listened to each of them with the kind of patience born only from surviving what they were now facing. And for once, technology wasn't a weapon. It was a shield. One rainy afternoon, the judge requested a meeting. It was brief. No cameras, no press. Just her and Elijah in a private chamber, where the walls still echoed with past decisions. She sat forward, hands folded, eyes less stern than he remembered. Her voice broke the silence with weight and clarity. She nearly destroyed him, she said. She didn't ask for forgiveness, only that he not let this place destroy others. Elijah didn't speak much. He only nodded, slow and steady, the kind of nod that held both understanding and a challenge. He left without looking back. As his story spread, it became more than headlines. It stirred something. Across the state, a committee formed, tasked with re-evaluating how courts handled digital evidence, particularly when minorities were involved. Lawyers debated, judges hesitated, but the conversation had begun. Elijah didn't expect sweeping change, not quickly. But he watched the cracks form in a system that had once seemed impenetrable. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Elijah sat outside his home beside his father. The porch creaked beneath them, the air still and warm. His father, voice quiet and thoughtful, asked if he still believed truth always won. Elijah leaned back, eyes fixed on the sky, and after a moment answered with the faintest trace of a smile. But he believed truth fought harder than most people expected.